Thatcher Sterling handed the vintage key of the Azure Suite to his mistress in front of 200 guests, and the antique brass gleamed in Sloane Kensington's hand, as if 40 years of history at the Monterey Crest Hotel could be compressed into a single gesture of betrayal. Elowen stood on the first step of the grand ballroom, her champagne flute perfectly still between her fingers, listening to the Pacific waves crash against the rocky cliffs outside, and her husband speaking into the microphone. Today, the hotel enters a new era, guided by a woman fully capable of taking it into the future. Sloane smiled, draped in a stunning crimson gown, while the Sterling family clapped with calculated polite restraint. Elowen waited for Thatcher to correct his phrasing, to say that she would continue in her role as director, that this was all just an aggressive marketing stunt. He looked at her from across the room and finished the thought. Elowen has played her part with dedication, but the time has come to hand over the keys. Someone let out a low chuckle near the mahogany bar. Elowen felt her face burn. "Thatcher, what are you doing?" she asked when he finally stepped off the small stage. He approached her without dropping his charismatic smile. "I'm saving this hotel from the past." She stared at the key in Sloane's hand. "Then why did you give her the key that belonged to my mother?" The silence that fell around them wasn't absolute. At parties thrown by old money, even shock learns to wear expensive perfume. The servers seamlessly continued circulating with trays of miniature crab cakes and truffle arancini. The jazz band transitioned into softer chords, and Cordelia Sterling, Thatcher's mother, brought a hand to her pearl necklace, as if Elowen's question had been a grotesque display of poor manners. Sloane pretended not to understand the gravity of that specific key. "Thatcher explained to me that the Azure Suite will be the flagship of our new brand," she said in a sweet, media-trained voice. "A dedicated space for elite clientele, press, and influencers." Elowen stared at the faded blue enamel pendant attached to the worn brass ring. The edges scratched where the initials CV were almost entirely rubbed away. Calavance. Her mother, the woman who had spent half her life oscillating between the industrial laundry, the front desk, and a cramped accounting back office where no one from the Sterling family ever liked to step foot. Mr. Silas, the hotel's most veteran concierge, approached with glistening eyes. He murmured, not realizing his own volume, "Miss Elowen, that key has never left the vault without your explicit permission." Cordelia whipped around instantly. "Silas, return to your post." Elowen heard the title Miss like someone finding a lit match in a pitch-black room. Thatcher gripped Elowen's arm with a cruel delicacy and guided her into the lateral service corridor, away from the champagne fountain and the hired event photographers. "Don't make a scene," he muttered, still flashing a rigid smile to passing guests. "The scene was you turning our hotel's anniversary into a coronation for your mistress." He let go of her arm. "Sloane is our new director of brand repositioning. The rest is your exhausted, paranoid imagination." Elowen let out a humorless laugh. "How long have you been sleeping with the director of brand repositioning?" His jaw tightened, just for a fraction of a second. "Sign the transition agreement and leave with your dignity." He pulled a slim folder from the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket, the signature lines marked with neon yellow flags. "You'll continue to receive a generous severance buyout. Keep your social reputation spotless, and prevent the guests from knowing things they have no business knowing." Elowen looked at the pages without touching them. "What things?" Thatcher tilted his head. "That you hold no actual equity in this hotel. You only managed what has always belonged to my family." She felt the blow, but she didn't step back. "If it's that simple, why wait for a gala to publicly evict me?" Before he could answer, Sloane appeared at the entrance of the hallway, holding the blue key as if she already possessed the deed to every wall in the building. "Thatch, the photographers want a shot of us in the historic lobby," she said. Then turned to Elowen with feigned, syrupy concern. "I know this is incredibly difficult, but maybe it's best if you go home and rest. Corporate restructuring is hard on any wife." Elowen took a step toward her. "Restructuring is changing the drapes. What you are holding isn't decor." Sloane lowered her gaze to the key. "It's just a symbol. Symbols don't have owners." Thatcher stepped between them. "Enough. The hotel needs capital infusion, visibility, and leadership that speaks the language of a modern demographic. You talk to maids, local vendors, and legacy guests as if nostalgia pays for structural renovations." Elowen felt an old, familiar shame threatening to rise. The shame of someone who had learned finance out of sheer necessity, not in a pricey Ivy League seminar. But the shame was immediately followed by a memory. Her mother, hunched over the heavy-bound ledger, saying that numbers don't lie as long as the hand holding the pen doesn't tremble. "I want to see the old ledger," she said. Thatcher's expression shifted only slightly, but enough. She didn't wait for his permission. She bypassed them, walking briskly down the service corridor, passing through the prep kitchen where two sous chefs suddenly pretended to be fascinated by plating dishes to avoid her eyes, and pushed into the old accounting room. It was a narrow space behind the front desk, lined with oak filing cabinets and smelling of stale coffee and aging paper. That was where the heavy, brown, leather-bound ledger from the hotel's first 2 decades was kept before the digital cloud systems, before the consulting firms, before Thatcher decided that their history needed to fit into a sleek PowerPoint presentation. The middle shelf was empty. All that remained was a clean rectangular outline in the dust where the heavy book had rested for decades. Elowen touched the clean wood with her fingertips and felt something inside her plummet. In the bottom drawer, she found a torn scrap of paper wedged between 2 archaic receipts. There was an incomplete line written in Cala's slanted cursive. Capital from Cala Vance applied to structural. The sentence ended at the tier. Behind her, a feminine voice spoke. "Looking for memories? Or proof?" Elowen turned around. Sloane stood in the doorway, and her expression was no longer sweet. It was purely vigilant. "You really shouldn't be in here," Sloane said, stepping in without asking. Elowen folded the scrap of paper and hid it in her closed fist. "Funny, I was about to tell you the same thing." Sloane glanced at the empty shelf and smirked. "Thatcher believes it's a liability to keep archaic documents where anyone emotionally unstable might tamper with them." Anyone? Or the wife who knows exactly where to look? "The ex-administrative director," Sloane corrected. Elowen felt the title cut, but not as deeply as it should have. Perhaps because the word wife had already been pulverized in the ballroom. "Do you have any idea what you're actually taking on?" Sloane stepped closer to the cabinets. "I am taking on a luxury property that needs to stop operating like a glorified bed and breakfast." Thatcher gets that. You don't. Her cruelty wasn't explosive. It was frictionless, impeccably tailored, almost aggressively corporate. Elowen tucked the folded paper into the inner lining of her bodice, making no effort to hide the motion. Sloane saw it, but didn't try to grab it. If that were actually important, Thatcher wouldn't have left it behind. Elowen lifted her chin. He didn't leave it behind. He just forgot how to look. When Elowen returned to the ballroom, Thatcher was back on stage. The massive digital screens displayed the hotel's new visual identity. The Crest exclusive, written in minimalist gold typography, over drone footage of the Monterey coastline. The word family had been entirely scrubbed. The vintage photos of Cala, of legacy staff, of guests who had returned for 30 years, all replaced by stock-like images of champagne flutes, infinity pools, and flawless bodies lounging on balconies. Thatcher was talking about venture capital, aggressive repositioning, and a strategic partnership with Sloane's hospitality group. Cordelia smiled beside him, as rigid as a marble statue. Elowen marched down the center aisle, the scrap of paper burning against her skin, the question practically scalding her tongue. "Where is the ledger?" Her voice rang out much louder than she had planned. Thatcher's microphone caught the end of her question, and the entire room swiveled to look. He froze for a microsecond, then let out a practiced, booming laugh. "Elowen, please, let's not turn a historic evening into an argument over dead archives." She stopped right in front of the stage. Dead archives don't scare anyone. So why has it vanished? Cordelia paled visibly at the word vanished. Behind her, Sloane gripped the blue key until her knuckles turned white. Thatcher hopped down from the stage with alarming speed and spoke close enough that only the front rows could hear him. "Are you intentionally humiliating yourself?" Elowen answered without lowering her volume. "I wasn't the one who handed the oldest key in this building to my mistress." A collective gasp, short and starved for gossip, rippled through the ballroom. Sloane took a step back, offended more by the public exposure than by the actual guilt. Thatcher shoved the transition folder hard against Elowen's chest. "Sign it now, before I have security physically remove you from the premises." The word security made a few of the veteran staff shift uncomfortably. Mr. Silas, standing near the cloakroom, looked ready to intervene, but Elowen gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She refused to let a 70-year-old man risk his livelihood for her pride. She took the folder, opened it to the first page, and read the clause, stating she was voluntarily resigning from the administration of the Monterey Crest. Voluntarily, The lies were always drafted in such immaculate legalese. "I am not signing my own eviction notice," she said. Thatcher smiled, void of any warmth. "Then you will be escorted out as a trespasser on property that was never yours." Alowan looked at the assembled Sterling family, at Sloane holding Calla's key, at the very bones of the hotel that seemed to breathe behind the drywall. "We'll see." The party ended without officially ending. The jazz band resumed playing. The guests feigned polite conversation, and Sloane was whisked away by Thatcher for a curated photo op in the historic lobby. Alowan walked up the service stairwell to the hallway of the Azure Suite not to enter, but to look at the solid oak door her mother used to personally polish before holiday weekends. A new, heavily built security guard was stationed there, far too young to understand why that door mattered. "Ma'am. I have strict orders not to permit access." The word ma'am, stripped of her name, stung in a pathetic, small way. Elowen nodded. "I'm not going in." He looked visibly relieved. Before heading back down, she traced the doorframe and noticed a fresh, deep scratch near the lock. Someone had forcefully tested a key. Lower down, where the wood met the baseboard, lay a tiny chip of blue enamel. She picked it up, closing it in her palm alongside the scrap of paper. When she reached the ground floor, she found Mr. Silas lingering near the coat check, pretending to organize uncollected umbrellas. Without making eye contact, he slipped a thin envelope into her hand. "Miss Calla always said if you ever asked for the book and no one answered, you were to look for the man who saw the numbers that wouldn't balance." Alowan opened the envelope just enough to see an aged business card. Beckett Thorne, Independent Auditing. Thatcher caught up to her at the lateral exit, just before she stepped out onto the damp, fog-heavy pavement. Behind him, the lobby lights illuminated Sloane, who was posing for official portraits, as if the night had been a flawless triumph. "If you go digging for that ledger, I will publicly release medical records detailing your mother's mental instability during her final years," he said, devoid of any residual affection. Alowan felt the threat drag across Calla's memory like toxic sludge, but she refused to let him see her bleed. "My mother died protecting this hotel. Do not weaponize her exhaustion." Thatcher leaned in. "Your mother was a hired maid. You are an employee. I let you believe you were more because it made the marriage convenient." The sentence nearly knocked the wind out of her. Nearly. Elowen pulled Beckett Thorne's business card from the envelope and held it up to his face. "Then you won't mind if I ask an auditor why a hired maid had capital equity recorded in your family's ledger?" For the first time all evening, Thatcher didn't have a pre-packaged response. Elowen walked down the grand entrance steps without looking back. Below, the dark waters of Monterey Bay crashed against the seawall, and the scrap of paper in her hand felt far too small to topple an empire. But it had her mother's handwriting, and tonight, that was enough to start a war. Beckett Thorne didn't ask if Alowan was all right when he opened his office door. And for that exact reason, she almost trusted him. The old business card had led her to a narrow office on Cannery Row, situated above a stationery shop that sold custom stamps. It had a partial view of the bay and reeked of heavily reheated coffee. He was younger than she remembered from his brief, tense meetings at the hotel years ago, but he wore the perpetually exhausted expression of someone who aged by distrusting balance sheets and legacy surnames. Upon seeing the torn page with Calla's handwriting, he didn't immediately reach for it. "If this card found its way to you, someone inside the crest is terrified," he said. Elowen placed the paper flat on his desk. "I didn't come to talk about fear. I came to talk about the ledger that vanished." Beckett stared at the ragged tear, at Calla's name, at the interrupted word capital suspended in a sentence that seemed desperate to survive. "This is a clue." "It's not proof." Alowan pressed her lips together. "Yesterday, my husband handed the key to the Azure Suite to his mistress, then called me an employee on a power trip. Forgive me if I am entirely out of patience for subtlety." He looked up. "Subtlety doesn't matter. The sequence matters." The phrase irritated her more than it should have. Perhaps because Calla used to say the exact same thing when teaching her how to close the daily registers. Elowen sat down uninvited and placed the chip of blue enamel on the desk next to the paper. Beckett pulled a jeweler's loupe from a drawer, examined the ink and the paint chip, maintaining a clinical detachment that bordered on insulting. "I audited the crest for 8 months. I left because there were pages that actively refused to balance." "Left or ran away?" The accusation slipped out before she could temper it. He absorbed the hit without blinking. I was abruptly terminated after I refused to sign off without access to the historical bound ledger. Elowen sat perfectly still. Thatcher told the board you tried to sell proprietary financial data to a rival hospitality group. Beckett let out a short, hollow laugh. Of course he did. That's how traditional money turns inconvenient questions into corporate treason. For the first time, her simmering rage found a solid wall to lean against. Why didn't you ever come to me? Because I assumed you were in on it. The answer hurt in an entirely unexpected way. Elowen thought of the years she had walked those hallways carrying master keys, adjusting spreadsheets, organizing housekeeping schedules, sending orchids to loyal VIPs, naively believing she was managing a house that respected her. I didn't know, she whispered. Beckett's voice softened, just a fraction. Then someone went to great lengths to keep you far too busy to ever ask the right questions. Her phone vibrated on the desk, cutting through the silence with the practical cruelty of modern technology. It was an email from Thatcher, CC'd to her old corporate address. Effective immediately, your access to all administrative and back-of-house areas is suspended due to behavior incompatible with family governance. Immediately following it was a text from Sloane, polite as a switchblade. Please avoid any further embarrassments. We are actively trying to protect your public image. Elowen slid the phone across to Beckett. He took a photo of the screen, logged the timestamp, and pushed it back. Do not set foot in that hotel without legal authorization. She laughed in absolute disbelief. That building holds my mother's documents. That is exactly why they want you inside, Beckett shot back. In the wrong place? At the wrong time? With the security cameras rolling, Elowen stood up. You talk as if I can just sit here sipping bad coffee while they shred my entire life. I talk like someone who has watched an honest person get buried alive because they were in a rush. That sentence should have acted as brakes for Elowen. Instead, it ignited an ancient humiliation, the lifelong habit of obeying commands to appear reasonable. My mother was patient her entire life, she snapped. She died with her legacy hidden on a torn piece of scrap paper. Beckett didn't reply immediately. He opened a battered metal filing cabinet and pulled out photocopies of incomplete financial reports from the Crest, heavily marked in red ink. He showed Elowen entries for massive historical renovations, massive deposits with murky origins, laundry supply invoices that were astronomically high, and a repeating alphanumeric code, AS7. I could never crack this code. It always appeared adjacent to major capital expenditures, always during the years your mother ran the books. Elowen furrowed her brow. Azure Suite. Beckett looked at her. Are you absolutely sure? My mother abbreviated the suite as AS when drafting the deep cleaning rosters. And supply closet number 7 is located in the service corridor of the Heritage Wing, right near the climate-controlled wine cellar. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew her mind was made up. Beckett saw it too. Elowen. Don't. She snatched up the torn scrap of paper. You told me the sequence matters. The sequence points straight to the cellar. The sequence points to filing a legal injunction for discovery, not breaking and entering. It's easy to play the hero when it wasn't your mother relegated to a footnote. Beckett slammed the file shut with heavily controlled force. Do not walk blindly into the trap they just set for you. Elowen walked out before his pragmatism could catch her. She waited for the coastal fog to roll in heavy off the Pacific, returning to the Monterey Crest via the alleyway, wearing the darkest, most unremarkable trench coat she owned and a scarf pulled over her hair. It wasn't a cinematic disguise. She was just a woman trying to shrink beneath the weight of her own grief. The loading dock gate, the same one local purveyors had used since Kala's era, still opened with the ancient laundry department passcode. That realization felt like a paper cut. They had forgotten to erase the code for the bedsheets, but they had effortlessly erased her name from the administration. In the subterranean corridor, the lighting was dimmed. The scent of industrial floor wax mixed with sea salt violently resurrected her entire childhood. She bypassed the prep kitchen, the boiler room, and descended the short stairwell to the wine cellar. The security camera mounted above the archway was angled slightly downward, different from its usual sweeping rotation. Elowen noticed it a second too late, but her momentum carried her forward. At Closet 7, the brass deadbolt bore fresh, metallic scratches. She pulled out a small master key Kala had left on her personal keyring, turned it slowly, and pulled the door open. Inside, the dust had been heavily disturbed. An old leather binding strap lay discarded next to a ripped archival tag bearing the barely legible words, Bound Ledger. The book had been there. Elowen's hand trembled as she touched the empty wooden slat. The magnitude of her mistake fully formed in her chest before a single voice echoed behind her. She should have listened to Beckett. She should have taken a time-stamped photo of the door and left. She should have waited, breathed, and followed the methodical order that men in offices with expensive pens call due process. But there was a gaping void in the closet, and the void was shaped exactly like her mother. Pushed to the very back corner of the shelf, she found a tri-folded receipt, yellowed with age. It bore Calavance's signature alongside the sprawling signature of Harrison Sterling, Thatcher's father. The phrase "equity converted" was visible just above a dark water stain. Elowen slid the receipt into the inner pocket of her coat. In that exact second, the harsh overhead fluorescent lights snapped on. Sloane was standing at the top of the cellar stairs, flanked by 2 private security contractors, her smartphone raised and recording. "Well, what a surprise," she said, her voice dripping with anything but. Thatcher stepped out from behind her. He wore a dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his face pale with a deeply satisfied fury. "I warned the board she would attempt to steal proprietary documents." Elowen glanced at the repositioned camera and finally understood the stage design. "Steal what, Thatcher?" "The closet is entirely empty." Her voice was remarkably steady, even as her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Sloane kept the camera fixed on her, capturing every ragged breath. "You bypassed a secure gate, trespassed into a restricted administrative zone, opened a locked cabinet, and you are currently concealing company property inside your coat." Elowen took a slow step backward. "You knew I would come." Thatcher let out a low chuckle. "You always come running the second someone disrespects your mother's memory. It's painfully predictable." The sheer sadism of his statement was more confirming than a signed confession. One of the security guards stepped forward, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to empty your pockets." Elowen locked eyes with Thatcher. "If either of them touches me without a formal police warrant, you are going to have to explain in a deposition why you re-angled a security camera before this alleged break-in." Sloane's phone wavered for half a second. Thatcher caught the hesitation and ground his teeth. "Stop being so dramatic. You are trespassing on property you no longer have any legal right to manage." Elowen slowly reached into her coat, pulling out the receipt and holding it up by the very edge so they could see it, but remaining out of grabbing distance. "Then explain to the camera why a receipt bearing your late father's signature was rotting in a supply closet where the corporate ledger was supposed to be kept." Thatcher's face drained of color. The shift was microsecond fast, but Sloane's camera was still rolling. Beckett arrived before the private police force Thatcher was threatening to summon. He was led down the corridor by Mr. Silas, who was expertly feigning a severe shortness of breath. "I called him," the old concierge confessed, leaning heavily on a wine barrel. "Miss Calla, forgive me, but you never did learn how to wait your turn." Beckett assessed the absolute disaster in 3 seconds. Elowen cornered, Sloane recording. Thatcher standing way too close to the lens, the open supply closet, the freshly gouged lock. "Nobody touches another document, and nobody touches another person from this second forward," Beckett announced, holding up his state auditor credentials. He spoke with a terrifyingly clinical calm that instantly forced everyone else in the room to look unhinged if they raised their voices. Thatcher pointed a shaking finger at Elowen. "She broke into this hotel." Beckett looked directly up at the ceiling camera. "And was that camera manually repositioned before or after you unilaterally decided she was going to commit a felony?" Sloane slowly lowered her phone an inch. Elowen saw it. Beckett saw it too. Furthermore, Beckett continued smoothly. "If there has been a corporate theft, we will inventory this closet right now, on the record." "What exactly was housed on that shelf, Thatcher?" Thatcher didn't answer. Elowen felt the silence echo through the entire concrete hallway. The formal legal charges didn't drop that night, but the public execution arrived well before sunrise. Thatcher deployed a mass internal memo to the Sterling board members, major shareholders, and department heads stating that Elowen had been intercepted, accessing restricted areas, and attempting to remove historical documentation without authorization. Sloane added her own addendum to the PR and marketing teams, instructing that any press inquiries regarding the former director be met with a standardized dealing with a private health matter response. Elowen read the emails on the cracked leather sofa in Beckett's office, her coat still smelling of the damp wine cellar, dried sea salt clinging to her face. "You played exactly the role they cast for you," Beckett said, offering no verbal painkillers. She tossed her phone onto his desk. I found a receipt with Harrison's signature. And in exchange, I handed them a perfectly framed surveillance video. Would you rather I sit perfectly still while my husband paints my mother as delusional and brands me a common thief? Beckett rubbed his face, looking older than his years. My father lost 30 years of professional reputation over a corporate account that wouldn't balance. He tried to prove it by himself. He broke into the archives by himself. He walked out in handcuffs. He leaned over the desk. I am not demanding you stay calm because it's elegant. I'm demanding it because I've already seen the bottom of the cliff. Aloan looked down at her hands. For the first time, his abrasive rigidity felt less like corporate arrogance and more like scar tissue. They worked until the morning fog began to burn off Monterey Bay. Beckett downloaded the video Sloan had inevitably leaked to a private hospitality networking group. He ran it side by side with raw security footage Mr. Silas had quietly pulled from the server. He showed Aloan a glaring 2-minute gap just prior to her entering the cellar. The camera had been tilted to frame the cabinet perfectly, but after the person who emptied it had already left the frame. The receipt Aloan had salvaged bore dried, brittle glue along its left edge, indicating it had been forcefully torn from a larger bound page, and the code AS7 appeared in 3 separate historical audits. Always aligning with the exact month a massive construction bill was paid without a clearly sourced capital injection. Beckett drew a timeline on a whiteboard and tapped his marker against the Azure Suite on the hotel's floor plan. If the ledger isn't in Closet 7, maybe Closet 7 was just a staging area, a transit point. Exhausted to her marrow, Aloan looked at the tiny chip of blue paint she still carried in her purse. Sloan has the key. Beckett nodded. And Thatcher made a highly public spectacle of handing her that exact key. He wanted everyone looking at the woman, not the room. She understood before he even finished the sentence. The ledger wasn't lost. It was buried inside the very suite the husband had gifted the mistress. And to get it back, Aloan wouldn't just have to break through a solid oak door, she would have to break through the narrative everyone had already started writing about her. The morning sun transformed Aloan into a piece of corporate gossip before she could even finish her first black coffee in Beckett's office. Thatcher's memo was actively pinging across the smartphones of every employee at the Monterey Crest Hotel with the vicious speed of sanctioned slander. Former director apprehended in restricted zone, attempted removal of assets. Enhanced asset protection protocols activated. Not a single line mentioned the missing ledger, the manipulated camera angles, or the receipt bearing Calavance's signature. Sloan, vastly more media-savvy, had instructed the PR department to pivot exclusively to forward-facing messaging. By 11 a.m., the hotel was hosting local journalists, travel influencers, and Silicon Valley angel investors for a VIP brunch to unveil the Crest exclusive, acting as if Aloan's alleged breakdown was merely a speck of dust swept under an expensive Persian rug. Beckett read the forwarded itinerary Silas had sent and slowly closed his laptop. They're accelerating the timeline to bury the news cycle. Aloan, who had spent the entire night with the torn scrap of paper pressed against her chest inside her coat, replied without looking at him. Narrative is just a corporate word for a lie catered with smoked salmon. Beckett almost smiled. And an open bar usually convinces people faster than a dusty receipt. She met his gaze. Then let's take the dusty receipt to the open bar. Beckett didn't want her setting foot inside the hotel, and Aloan knew his list of legal risks before he even opened his mouth. They have edited footage, a fresh trespassing narrative, and a lobby full of venture capitalists, primed to view you as the hysterical, vindictive ex-wife, he said, swiftly gathering copies of the receipt, the camera stills, and the AS7 timeline into a black leather portfolio. If you walk in there looking unhinged, Thatcher wins the war today. Aloan took a deep breath. If I don't walk in there, Sloan permanently owns the history of this building. The argument wasn't just about legal strategy. It was the first genuine collision between them. Beckett demanded methodology, emotional distance, and airtight control. Aloan demanded that her mother not be buried a second time. You told me to trust the sequence, she said, her voice hard. The sequence right now is gala, theft of the ledger, staged video, rebranding. Their next step is using my absence as a silent confession. Beckett slid the documents into the portfolio and snapped it shut. Fine. But we enter as a formal legal inquiry. Not as a hurricane. She grabbed her coat. I can't promise I'll be a gentle breeze. He opened the door, Just don't be the exact wildfire they're banking on. The grand lobby of the Monterey Crest was entirely unrecognizable when Aloan walked through the revolving doors. Sleek, opaque white panels had been erected, completely covering the historic sepia photographs of legacy guests and founders. The vibrant local coastal flora had been replaced by sterile, pale architectural arrangements. A glowing, LED-lit architectural model dominated the center of the room, showcasing a proposed cantilevered glass infinity pool, an ultra-VIP lounge, and a new logo that actively erased any trace of family heritage. The Crest exclusive. Sloan was holding court in the center of the room, flashing a mathematically perfect smile for the press, while Thatcher confidently explained to a tech investor how this modernization would aggressively purge the sentimental inefficiencies that were stalling their quarterly growth. That specific phrase hit Aloan like a physical blow. Every year of her mother's life, reduced to a sentimental inefficiency. A local lifestyle reporter recognized her hovering near a marble pillar and immediately raised his iPhone. "Are you the former director involved in last night's security incident?" Beckett stepped smoothly to her side before the word incident could become a permanent label. "Miss, Vance is present today to file a formal request for an inventory of historical corporate documents and to clarify several alarming financial discrepancies. Any presumption of criminal liability prior to discovery is highly actionable." Thatcher heard the commotion and cut through the crowd with calculated, aggressive strides. "Beckett Thorne, again. You always seem to materialize wherever there's dead weight in the archives." Beckett responded without altering his heart rate. "And you always seem to start sweating when the dead weight starts asking questions." Sloan noticed the journalists edging closer, smelling blood in the water. She decided to instantly convert the tension into a theatrical performance. She stepped onto the lobby's elevated landing and projected her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin our exclusive guided tour of the property's future, starting with the Azure Suite, which is currently being gutted to create a truly bespoke presidential experience for our high-net-worth guests." Aloan's stomach violently contracted. "She's taking them up there right now." Beckett checked his watch. "Or she's going up there to prove there's absolutely nothing left to find." Thatcher stepped into Aloan's personal space. His voice dropped to a register that sounded intimate to the cameras but was utterly venomous. "Leave, Aloan. Every second you stand here, you are permanently destroying your own reputation." She didn't flinch. "My reputation was never the thing you were trying to protect," he sneered. "Kala would be mortified watching you play the pathetic, abandoned housewife." The blade slid in deep, and for a terrifying second, Aloan felt the floor tilt beneath her. Up on the landing, Sloan was ushering a herd of influencers toward the glass-backed panoramic elevator. Beckett lightly touched Aloan's forearm. "Do not engage with a man who uses a dead woman as a human shield." She inhaled sharply, desperately searching her own chest for Kala's stoic resilience, rather than Thatcher's inflicted wounds. "I'm not leaving," Aloan said, "but I'm also not going to chase her up those stairs like a suspected shoplifter." Help arrived from the most unlikely corner of the lobby. Mrs. Hattie, the formidable head of housekeeping, a petite woman with tightly pinned hair and eyes that had watched decades of wealthy people lie in these exact hallways, appeared pushing a heavy linen cart. She aggressively adjusted a stack of Egyptian cotton towels, bumping the cart loudly enough to park it directly next to Aloan. "Your mother wouldn't be mortified at all, sweetie," Hattie murmured without moving her lips. Aloan turned slowly. "You knew my mother better than I thought, Hattie." Hattie kept her eyes locked on the elevator doors sliding shut on Sloan, Thatcher, and the press corps. "I knew her well enough to remember the Tuesday she sold her Victorian house in Pacific Grove just to pay the contractors for the roof repair after the El Niño storms." The lobby suddenly felt incredibly small. Beckett went completely rigid. "You saw that happen?" Hattie gave a sharp nod. "I watched her cry inside the industrial laundry room, holding the bank wire receipt." Mr. Harrison Sterling came down himself, swore to God that her money would become permanent equity in the building, told her the Sterling family would never, ever forget it. Aloan felt her hot rage crystallize into absolute ice. "Why did no one ever tell me?" Hattie finally looked down at her orthopedic shoes. "Because Miss Calla demanded absolute silence. She thought a legal promise written in the master ledger was worth more than the gossip of a housekeeper," Beckett muttered, mostly to himself. Except they burned the ledger. While Sloan paraded the press through the Azure Suite, Beckett quietly asked Hattie if there were any surviving housekeeping logs tied to the code AS7. The older woman hesitated. The bone-deep terror of losing health insurance and a pension doesn't just vanish because the truth comes knocking. Eloan reached out and gripped Hattie's calloused hand. "I don't want you to ruin your life for me, Hattie." Hattie's spine snapped straight with an unexpected, fierce dignity. "Honey, I've done enough damage to my soul by staying quiet." 10 minutes later, she returned with a cracked, plastic-covered linen control binder salvaged from beneath a pile of condemned duvets. Inside, the code AS7 appeared in several marginalized notes regarding special deliveries to the Azure Suite, always accompanied by the word vault, written in microscopic shorthand. Beckett photographed the pages and immediately spotted an anomaly. On the night of the anniversary gala, logged at 2:20 a.m., there was a fresh entry written in a completely different handwriting. It documented the delivery of extra plush robes for guest SK and the transfer of a heavy brown box into the suite. Eloan traced the ink as if she could push her finger through the paper. SK. Sloane Kensington. Beckett nodded grimly. And a heavy brown box could legally be argued as anything. "No, it can't," Hattie interjected, her voice trembling slightly. "When an old book is that heavy, we haul it in a towel crate so the night auditors don't ask questions." The confirmation should have brought relief. Instead, it spiked the adrenaline. At that exact moment, Eloan's phone buzzed. It was a covert text from Silas. Sloane just ordered an emergency maintenance crew to demo the antique mirror in the Azure Suite first thing tomorrow morning. Told them the room needed to look clean for an Architectural Digest shoot. Beckett read the screen and closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. If there's a wall safe or a cavity behind that mirror, they are going to drill it out or incinerate the contents before a judge ever signs a discovery order. Eloan gripped the edge of the cart. "So now you're going to tell me we have to sit back and wait for a subpoena." He looked at the grand staircase, the descending elevator, the lobby swarming with cameras and vultures. "I'm going to tell you to do it in a way that legally castrates them." The shift in his tone caught her off guard. Beckett was no longer trying to pull her back from the ledge. He was trying to turn her free fall into a precision strike. "We need a formal, highly public request for the preservation of a historic site, with credible witnesses present, recorded before the maintenance crew arrives. And we need to rip Thatcher out of his comfort zone." Eloan understood the immense risk. To do that, she would have to ignite a public confrontation without looking like a scorned woman throwing a tantrum. Up on the landing, Sloane was returning from the tour, glowing, practically vibrating with triumph, telling a reporter that the Azure Suite carried an energy of absolute rebirth. Eloan let go of the cart and marched straight toward the center of the room before her own survival instincts could drag her back. "Sloane!" she called out, her voice engineered to perfectly slice through the ambient noise, interrupting the reporter's next question. "Do you mind explaining to the press why you just ordered the demolition of the antique mirror in the Azure Suite prior to the mandatory legal inventory of the hotel's historical assets?" The entire lobby went dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses. Sloane blinked just once, a glitch in the programming. Thatcher lunged forward to intercept, but he couldn't physically snatch the question out of the air. "This is getting genuinely pathetic," Thatcher announced loudly. "Now even interior decorating is a conspiracy theory?" Beckett stepped up, raising the black portfolio so the cameras could track it. When a specific room linked directly to unresolved historical accounting codes is scheduled for emergency demolition exactly 12 hours after the disappearance of the master corporate ledger, the state auditor's office calls that willful destruction of evidence. A prominent Silicon Valley investor, who had been swooning over the glass pool model 3 minutes earlier, crossed his arms. What ledger? That two-word question dealt more structural damage to the company than any lawsuit. Thatcher's neck flushed red. An archaic, utterly irrelevant antique book. Eloan stepped right into the crack in his armor. "Then preserve it." Sloane smiled, but it looked brittle, like cracking ice. "You want to force your way into a suite that isn't yours?" Eloan stared directly at the vintage key dangling from Sloane's wrist. "I want to stop you from taking a sledgehammer to the walls my mother paid for." The sentence ripped through the room like a cold front shattering a window. Over by the reception desk, Cordelia Sterling took an involuntary, staggering step backward. Thatcher saw it. Eloan saw it. There was far too much unfiltered truth written across the matriarch's posture. Before a journalist could shout out a question asking who exactly Kala was, Thatcher grabbed the wireless microphone from the podium and adopted the grave, long-suffering posture of a deeply wounded patriarch. I sincerely apologize to our guests. My wife has been struggling with a severe emotional crisis ever since the board voted to transition to a modernized corporate structure. Elowen felt the jaws of the oldest trap in the world snapping shut. Turn a woman's memory into instability. Turn missing documents into petty jealousy. Turn a mother's sacrifice into a psychiatric episode. But this time, Beckett didn't stand quietly in the background. "Mr. Sterling," Beckett said, projecting his voice without needing a microphone, "are you willing to state, on the record, in front of this press corps, that Calavance never contributed personal financial capital to the structural renovations of this property?" Thatcher froze. Sloane whipped her head to look at him, genuinely blindsided for the first time. Cordelia clutched her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. The suffocating silence answered the question before a single word was spoken. Thatcher finally swallowed hard. "Employees. Support the company in many ways over the years." Elowen felt the degradation twist into a weapon. "My mother sold her home to keep a roof over your head." "That isn't support, Thatcher. That is salvation." Near the back of the lobby, several of the older staff members lowered their heads not out of second-hand embarrassment for Elowen, but out of profound, devastating recognition. The afternoon ended in a brutally incomplete victory and a painful tactical defeat. Beckett successfully managed to file an emergency preservation order for the Azure Suite with the family board members present, legally anchoring it with the photocopied receipt, the housekeeping logs, the leaked maintenance work order, and the credible threat of asset destruction. But Thatcher secured exactly what he needed, too. By sunset, a heavily spliced 30-second video was circulating on local news blogs. It showed Elowen aggressively confronting Sloane in the lobby, cut exactly 1 second before Elowen asked about the mirror. The headline read, "Former director berates new management in jealous outburst." Elowen watched the clip on her phone inside Beckett's car, parked 2 blocks up the hill overlooking the Pacific. For the first time that entire day, she broke down and cried purely out of rage. They always cut the tape right before the part that actually matters. Beckett kept his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, leaving the engine off. "Which is exactly why we are going to force the part that matters to play out live, with no edits." She let out a wet, bitter laugh. "You say that like controlling the truth is just a matter of logistics. It's not." "No, it's not. But tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., if the board approves the injunction, we are walking into the Azure Suite with a legal proxy and a court reporter." Elowen leaned her head against the cold glass of the passenger window. "And if they deny the injunction?" Beckett looked down the hill at the glowing neon sign of the crest. "Then they take a crowbar to the wall at 7 a.m. She closed her eyes, visualizing her mother's elegant handwriting being pulverized into drywall dust behind a coat of expensive blue paint. When she opened her eyes, her voice was hoarse, but the tremor was gone. "Then the truth needs to wake up before 7 a.m. At exactly 6:43 a.m., Elowen walked into the marble lobby of the Monterey Crest before the contracted maintenance crew was cleared to take the service elevator. She was not alone. Beckett strode beside her, gripping the black legal portfolio. Mrs. Hattie marched directly behind them, clutching the plastic-wrapped linen ledger flat against her chest like body armor. Mr. Silas carried a manila envelope containing the unedited server logs. 2 senior members of the Sterling Board of Directors dragged out of bed by the PR nightmare Elowen had triggered the day before, flanked them, wearing the sour, resentful expressions of men who vastly preferred their legends to remain unexamined. Beside them walked a court-appointed notary public, a stern woman with thick tortoiseshell glasses and a clipboard, officially opening an affidavit of preservation right there on the front desk. Thatcher emerged from the elevators. His tailored shirt was misbuttoned, and he wore the haggard face of a man who had spent the night rapidly running out of lies. "This is a coordinated invasion of private property," he snapped, pointing a finger at Elowen. She glanced over at the 3 maintenance workers idling near the lobby cafe with sledgehammers and crowbars. "An invasion is smashing a wall to pieces before you inventory what's buried behind it." Sloane arrived seconds later from the grand staircase, still wearing the blue key on her wrist, looking drastically paler than she had at the gala. "The suite is currently occupied by a guest." She attempted to deflect. Beckett answered before Elowen had to. "Exactly. It is occupied by the one person who was inexplicably gifted the room directly tied to a missing financial ledger." Thatcher tried to hijack the narrative again, turning the lobby into his personal stage. He barked about guest privacy, corporate defamation, and emotional harassment. But this morning, there were no influencers to impress. There was only paper. Beckett slammed his portfolio onto the marble desk. He laid out the photocopy of Calla's receipt, the housekeeping logs showing the 2 a.m. transfer, Sloane's emergency demolition order, the time-stamped camera discrepancies, and the bleak photo of the empty Closet 7. "No one here is declaring criminal guilt prior to a physical examination," Beckett stated, looking directly at the 2 board members. "We are simply executing a legal hold to prevent a highly probable piece of evidence from being removed, incinerated, or conveniently rebranded as decor." A voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Cordelia Sterling stood there in a heavy silk robe, her face too severely drawn for someone who had supposedly just woken up. When she saw the thick stack of papers on the desk, she froze. Elowen read the sheer terror in the older woman's posture before a single confession was uttered. "You knew," Elowen said. It wasn't a question. Cordelia descended 2 steps, gripping the mahogany banister, but said nothing. Thatcher raised his voice to a shout. "My mother will not be subjected to an interrogation by an unstable, vindictive woman." Elowen held his gaze, her spine made of steel. "My mother was silenced for 3 decades. Today, your mother gets to choose if she wants to die, doing the exact same thing." The heavy, suffocating silence that followed did more structural damage than a wrecking ball. They ascended in a tense, claustrophobic group via the glass elevator, while the early morning California sun began to paint Monterey Bay in hues of gold and violet, a light far too beautiful for the ugly autopsy about to happen. Elowen stood facing the glass, feeling the thud of her own heartbeat synchronize with the mechanical hum of the elevator. Even an ounce of comfort would give her permission to collapse. Sloane was gripping the blue key so fiercely the skin around her knuckles was practically translucent. In the hallway of the Azure Suite, the deep scratch near the deadbolt looked even more violent under the morning sconce lights. The maintenance workers had already laid out canvas drop cloths and leaned a heavy toolbox against the baseboard directly beneath the massive, antique oak mirror that Sloane had ordered removed. The notary requested that everyone state their names for the official audio recording. Thatcher scoffed loudly. "You are subjecting this entire corporation to extreme legal liability over a piece of inherited furniture." Mrs. Hattie, who had spent 40 years making herself invisible to these people, spoke up. Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the hallway. "An antique piece of furniture doesn't hide from an inventory." Elowen looked at her, entirely overwhelmed with gratitude. Sloane finally unlocked the door. The suite smelled aggressively of fresh latex paint and expensive lilies, but beneath the chemical cover-up, there was the undeniable, ancient odor of aged wood, sea salt, and buried secrets. The Azure Suite looked as though it had been lobotomized. The hand-embroidered drapes Calla had painstakingly sourced were gone, replaced by sterile, minimalist blinds. Garish gold-leaf throw pillows littered the bed, and a leather binder embossed with the Crest exclusive sat on the desk. But the massive antique mirror still dominated the eastern wall. It was incredibly heavy, encased in a thick, ornate blue wooden frame, and chipped severely in the bottom left corner. Elowen felt the tiny flake of blue paint at the bottom of her purse suddenly weigh like an anchor. Beckett instructed the maintenance crew not to move an inch until the notary had thoroughly photographed the room. Flashbulbs illuminated the wall, the frame, the toolbox, and the key still dangling from Sloane's wrist. Thatcher crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You are not going to find whatever psychotic delusion you've invented." Elowen walked slowly toward the mirror. She pulled the tiny chip of blue paint from her pocket and held it up to the jagged wound on the frame. It slotted in perfectly, a piece of a broken body recognizing itself. Behind the heavy wooden molding, there was a hairline fracture in the paneling, almost invisible to the naked eye, where the wood yielded slightly to pressure. She pulled Calla's vintage brass master key from her pocket, the exact same key that had unlocked Closet 7. She looked back at Beckett. "If I am wrong about this, I will walk out of this hotel and never say another word." Beckett met her eyes, steady and unwavering. "And if you're right?" Elowen took a breath that filled her lungs with 40 years of air. "Then I never stopped speaking for her again." The brass key slid into the disguised notch with heavy resistance, as if the wall itself had forgotten how to yield. Elowen turned it with both hands. A sharp, metallic clack violently severed the tension in the room. The massive mirror unlatched and swung outward on hidden heavy-duty hinges, revealing not a high-tech modern safe, but a crude, narrow cavity carved directly into the original studs. It was built by a man who didn't care about luxury. He only cared about burying a heavy burden. Sloane stumbled backward. Thatcher lunged forward, his face panicked. Beckett threw his arm out, blocking him. "Nobody touches a thing. The area is officially under legal hold. The notary stepped up, her camera flashing relentlessly, documenting every particle of dust. Inside the dark cavity sat a battered brown towel crate, tightly bound with a decaying leather strap. The faded laundry tag stapled to the side simply read, S7. Elowen felt her eyes burn violently, but she refused to blink before she opened it. Inside the crate lay the massive, brown, leather-bound ledger. It was more degraded than she remembered, the edges chewed by time and silverfish, exhaling the unmistakable scent of old paper entombed in ocean air. Next to it rested a thick canvas bank envelope containing yellowed deposit slips, contractor invoices, Polaroid photographs of the roof being rebuilt after the storm, and a formal, notarized promissory note signed by Harrison Sterling and Calla Vance. Mrs. Hattie clamped a hand over her mouth and began to weep silently. Mr. Silas slowly took off his uniform cap, pressing it to his chest. Cordelia Sterling collapsed into the nearest velvet armchair, as if her bones had finally refused to support the weight of a 3-decade lie. Beckett carefully lifted the ledger out of the box and placed it on the suite's desk, gently moving Elowen's hands away before she could accidentally compromise the evidence. He flipped past the mundane early pages. Daily rates, industrial laundry soap, linen orders. He bypassed the lean years until he hit the densely packed pages, filled with frantic, slanted ink, massive construction payouts, and the exact sentence Elowen already knew by heart. Capital injection of $450,000 from Calla Vance, applied to structural preservation, converted into highly preferred equity stake per signed agreement with Harrison Sterling. Beckett read the sentence aloud, his voice echoing off the sterile new walls. Thatcher let out a bark of laughter, but the sound was completely hollow, practically snapping in half. That means absolutely nothing without legal context. It's a diary entry. Beckett pulled the canvas envelope open. He laid out 3 corresponding bank transfer receipts, the matching contractor invoices, and the signed promissory note in which Harrison Sterling explicitly acknowledged that Calla's financial contribution would be preserved in perpetuity as an equity stake for her daughter if the principal was not repaid with interest, prior to his death. The context, Beckett said, looking Thatcher dead in the eye, usually lives on the next page. Cordelia closed her eyes, tears leaking through her mascara. Elowen walked over to her mother-in-law. You knew that my mother wasn't just a maid. The older woman took a long, ragged breath before answering, her voice stripped of all its country club arrogance. Harrison always said he would eventually make it right. He said he would pay her back when the profits stabilized. Elowen felt a cold, clinical disgust wash over her. When? After she was dead? Across the room, Sloane dropped the blue key onto the desk as if the metal had suddenly turned to molten lead. She turned to Thatcher, her voice completely devoid of affection, replaced entirely by the venom of a bad investment. You swore to me this ledger was just sentimental garbage. Thatcher spun on her. You wanted the prestige of the hotel. You didn't care how the sausage was made. Sloane went ghost pale, because the accusation was entirely accurate. I wanted a clean asset for a brand merger. Not a massive family fraud wrapped in a bow with an ocean view. Thatcher lost the last thread of his composure. Fraud? My father built this empire with his bare hands. Elowen carefully closed the ledger, instinctively protecting the fragile spine. Your father needed my mother's money to stop his empire from sliding into the ocean. She took a paycheck during the day and put the deed to her own house into your roof at night. She put her retirement into your laundry machines. She wrote her name on a page that your family actively spent 30 years pretending couldn't be read. Cordelia brought a shaking hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. The notary requested that all statements be repeated clearly for the official audio transcript. And in that moment, looking at the blinking red light of the recorder, Thatcher finally realized that the room was no longer his stage. It was a deposition. It was a sequence. It was proof. The meeting descended into the main lobby, like a thunderstorm contained inside a glass elevator. The bound ledger was placed directly onto the antique reception desk, the exact spot where Thatcher had triumphantly announced the new branding the night before. The 2 Sterling board members immediately, and frantically, drafted an emergency motion to suspend any and all transfer of management to Sloane Kensington, pending a forensic audit of the newly discovered documents. The tech investor from Silicon Valley, tipped off by Sloane's own panicked PR team about a legal situation, walked into the lobby, listened to a partial reading of the promissory note, and his face shifted from mild intrigue to total radioactive caution. If the chain of title on this property is clouded by hidden equity, there is no merger, he stated flatly, before stepping outside to frantically call his legal team. The glowing architectural model of the Crest exclusive sat humming in the corner, suddenly looking incredibly small and pathetic next to the rotting brown book. Thatcher attempted one final desperate maneuver. He paced the marble floor, insisting that this could all be handled through quiet, internal arbitration, that Elowen was maliciously weaponizing a dead woman's grief, that the paperwork was likely past the statute of limitations. Beckett didn't argue with emotion. He simply unzipped his bag, pulled out a copy of the exact audit report that had gotten him fired years ago, and pointed to the AS7 anomalies that the board had willingly ignored. I lost my firm's contract because I asked this exact question 5 years too early, Beckett said, his voice ringing through the cavernous lobby. Today, there are enough attorneys and witnesses in the room to ensure the question actually survives the afternoon. Elowen looked at him and realized that this brutal victory wasn't just hers. It was handing something vital back to a man who had learned to be brutally cynical just to survive his own industry. It was Cordelia who finally broke the primary resistance. Not out of sudden moral clarity, but out of the sheer, crushing exhaustion of wearing a mask that no longer fit her face. Sitting on the lobby sofa, surrounded by staring staff members, furious board executives, and the silent notary, she spoke without once looking at her son. Calla sold her house. Harrison promised her equity in the LLC. Then he got sick. He died. Thatcher took over the CEO role far too young, and I convinced myself it was safer to leave the old wounds stitched shut. Thatcher stared at her as if she had just plunged a knife into his back. Mom, Cordelia refused to lift her eyes from the carpet. Old wounds just rot the bone when you try to cover them with expensive silk, Thatcher. Elowen felt Calla's name finally travel through the vast space of the lobby, not as a hushed, shameful whisper, but as an undeniable, load-bearing pillar. Sloane took a quiet step backward toward the exit, already calculating her PR exit strategy. Thatcher stood frozen in the center of the room, completely surrounded by everything he had ruthlessly tried to control. His mother confessing, his mistress retreating, the auditor documenting, the staff watching, the ledger wide open. Elowen walked calmly over to the glowing architectural model of the Crest exclusive and pulled the power cord directly from the wall. The neon lights died instantly. Not a single new blueprint enters this building as long as my mother's legacy is treated like a footnote. No one dared to interrupt her. By late morning, the vintage brass key to the Azure Suite was returned to Elowen's hand. There was no swelling orchestral music, no applause, no cinematic perfection. Sloane simply placed it on the marble counter, after signing the formal handover registry, her impeccably manicured fingers trembling with either rage or pure panic, likely both. You managed to win a room, Sloane sneered, desperately trying to salvage a scrap of her curated elegance. Elowen picked up the heavy brass key. No, I just found the door you were stupid enough to leave unlocked. Thatcher tried to approach Elowen one last time, but Mr. Silas stepped directly into his path. The old man didn't raise his hands, but he squared his shoulders with the immovable posture of a man who knew every ghost that haunted those halls, and exactly who belonged to them. Beckett gathered the photocopies. Before he placed the fragile original ledger into a secure, tamper-proof lockbox provided by the board, he looked at Elowen. Do you want a few minutes alone with it? She gently ran her hand over the cracked brown leather cover, feeling the grooves of time, the weight of her mother's labor, the rot of the lies, and the agony of the weight. Not right now, she said softly. Right now, it stays where every single person in this room has to look at it. The ledger was carried back to the old back office under the strict supervision of the notary. Elowen placed it back onto the middle shelf with her own 2 hands. As she stepped back, the clean rectangular outline in the dust vanished. For the first time in 30 years, the void had been filled. The Monterey Crest didn't legally change hands the exact second the book hit the shelf. It simply changed its silence. First, the staff began speaking Calla Vance's name out loud in the corridors, testing it on their tongues like a spell that had finally been unbanned. Then, the board of directors initiated emergency executive sessions, explicitly barring Thatcher from the boardroom. Finally, after days submerged in forensic accounting, verifying the vintage receipts, tracking the old bank wires, and legally validating Harrison's promissory letter, the corporate attorneys arrived at the exact conclusion the Sterling family had spent a lifetime avoiding. Calla Vance was never just an employee. She wasn't a generous maid. She wasn't a charity case. She had injected massive, stabilizing capital into the LLC, recorded on the official books, acknowledged in a binding contract, and never bought out or repaid. With accrued compound interest and the current valuation of the property, the equity she had purchased had automatically transferred to her sole heir. Elowen didn't just have a claim. She held a controlling interest. The legal findings were read in a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Monterey. No press, no cameras. Just Elowen, Beckett, Cordelia, the corporate attorneys, and Thatcher, who listened to every legal clause as if someone were actively ripping the brass letters of his surname off the front gates of the property. When the lead attorney concluded that any brand merger or management transfer involving Sloane Kensington was legally void without Elowen's signature as majority shareholder, Thatcher let out a manic, strangled laugh. "You are handing a $100 million coastal property over to her because of a rotting scrapbook?" Elowen replied without raising her voice above a conversational murmur. "No. You stole this property from my mother by pretending the scrapbook was a ghost." Sloane officially vacated the premises before noon the next day. No crimson gowns, no paparazzi, no blue key on her wrist. She requested one final private meeting with Elowen in the empty ballroom, where, just days prior, she had soaked in the applause. The massive acrylic model of the pool was gone, leaving a pale, clean square on the hardwood floor where it used to sit. Sloane was dressed in aggressively neutral beige, her hair pulled back into a severe clip, her face stripped of the bulletproof confidence of a woman who genuinely believed that aesthetics could override perjury. "I didn't know the full extent of the fraud," Sloane said, breaking the silence. Elowen stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sailboats out on the bay rather than looking at her. "But you knew enough to never ask for the receipts." Sloane swallowed hard, accepting the hit. "Thatcher pitched me an unencumbered asset, a hysterical soon-to-be ex-wife, and a board desperate to modernize. I wanted to believe it because it fit my portfolio perfectly." Elowen finally turned around. Convenience is usually the very first signature on a lie. Sloane let out a shaky breath and placed a slim manila folder on the catering table. Screenshots of his text messages, the internal memos directing the rebranding, the written directives instructing the PR team to frame you as a psychiatric risk. "I'm leaving them here because I absolutely refuse to be the scapegoat for a collapsing dynasty." Elowen picked up the folder not as an act of forgiveness, but as the final nail required to seal the coffin. Sloane paused at the double doors before exiting. "Are you going to keep the name The Crest?" Elowen looked up at the ornate, vaulted ceiling. "I'm keeping whatever part of the foundation is actually true. The rot gets gutted in the remodel." The final conversation with Thatcher took place inside the Azure Suite. Elowen specifically chose it because she refused to retreat from the exact room where he had tried to crown his betrayal. The suite was stripped of the garish pillows, the marketing binders, and the floral arrangements. The mirror hung open on its hinges, the cavity exposed. It smelled only of old wood and the ocean breeze, as if the room had finally exhaled after holding its breath for 3 decades. Thatcher walked in flanked by a junior attorney, but immediately asked to speak to her alone. Elowen refused. Beckett stood silently in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, not because Elowen didn't trust herself, but because she had finally learned that sometimes true protection just looks like someone standing firmly in your corner. Cordelia sat in the armchair near the window, looking 10 years older than she had on the night of the gala, entirely stripped of the energy required to defend her son, yet unwilling to abandon the tiny shred of truth she had finally admitted. Thatcher stared at the brass key resting on the desk. "You're really going to evict me from the hotel I grew up in?" Elowen took her time answering. "You evicted me from the hotel where my mother worked herself into the grave." He dragged a trembling hand down his face. "I was trying to save the business, Elle. You didn't see the spreadsheets, the ballooning debt, the black mold in the heritage wing, the legacy guests dying off." Sloane brought a massive cash injection and modern PR. She was a lifeline. Sloane brought a fresh coat of paint, Elowen corrected sharply. "My mother brought the actual roof." "There is a massive difference." He slapped his hand against the desk. "I was drowning. I was tired of inheriting a beautiful ruin." Elowen held his furious gaze without blinking. "So you decided to transform my mother's salvation into a theft." For the first time in their entire relationship, Thatcher's anger completely evaporated without an audience to feed it. It deflated into something pathetic and small. "My father spent his entire life telling me Calla was a wonderful woman, but that you don't mix business equity with pity." My mother agreed. Eventually, I agreed too. It was just easier. Cordelia squeezed her eyes shut. Elowen felt the near confession in her bones. It wasn't an apology. It was a demand for absolution. It was easier for you. For my mother, it was a sold house, an erased name, and a daughter actively conditioned to be grateful for the crumbs of her own inheritance. Thatcher looked at her with a profound, hollow sadness that might have been genuine. Or perhaps it was just the purest manifestation of terror. I never wanted you to find out like this. No. You never wanted me to find out at all. The silence between them weighed heavily with the corpse of their marriage, the rushed morning coffees, the nights she had fallen asleep beside him, genuinely believing she was protecting a family that was actively using her loyalty as a padlock. Thatcher touched the brass key on the desk, but he didn't pick it up. "And what about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elowen felt the gravity of the question, and with it, the fleeting memory of a love that might have actually existed before it was devoured by corporate loss mitigation. "We ended the second you handed the key to my mother's room to another woman, and tried to sell it to the world as the future." Cordelia wept into her hands, making no sound. Thatcher signed the severance of his management rights that afternoon. The weeks that followed were an era of aggressive, deep cleaning, and not just of the carpets. Elowen legally dissolved the Crest-exclusive trademark. She halted the demolition of the Heritage Wing, initiated a forensic audit of every vendor contract Thatcher had signed, and brought every single department head into the boardroom to listen to the operational truths they had buried out of fear. Mrs. Hattie produced 3 milk crates full of handwritten laundry and maintenance logs that had intentionally never been digitized. Mr. Silas unlocked a rusted filing cabinet in the basement, where he had hoarded decades of VIP guest letters, candid Polaroids of Calla working the front desk, and even a Christmas card Harrison Sterling had written in 1994, explicitly thanking Calla as the silent partner holding the walls up. Beckett organized the mountain of data with the meticulous, ruthless precision of a man who was finally watching numbers serve the truth rather than erase it. Yet, despite the victory, he handed in his notice, stating he would step away once the final transition audit was filed with the state. Elowen found him in the cramped back office, surrounded by stacks of manila folders, and felt a flare of irritation that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate governance. "You're walking away now? Right when the ledger is finally balancing?" He smiled softly, looking utterly exhausted, yet lighter than she had ever seen him. "Exactly because they are balancing. If I stay on payroll as your internal auditor, every piece of advice I give you will eventually feel like a conflict of interest. If I leave, maybe down the road, I can walk back into this building as a person." She pretended to intensely examine a catering invoice to hide the sudden, sharp drop in her stomach. "And do you want to walk back in?" Beckett answered without hesitation. "I want to be invited. I don't want to slip in through a legal loophole." Elowen looked at the middle shelf, where the heavy brown ledger now rested securely. "I'm learning to be deeply suspicious of easy doors." "I am too," he said quietly. "Which is why I'm perfectly willing to wait for the right key." 3 months later, the Monterey Crest Hotel officially reopened without an ounce of ostentatious fanfare. Elowen explicitly vetoed the elevated stage, the red carpet, and the drone photography. Instead, she hosted a sunlit morning reception in the grand lobby, setting up simple wooden chairs for the housekeeping staff, the legacy guests, the local vendors, the remaining board members, and a handful of local journalists. On the primary architectural wall, the exact spot where Sloane had erected opaque white panels to hide the past, there was now a massive, beautifully curated timeline of the property. Directly in the center, a restored black and white photograph of Calla Vance in her crisp laundry uniform hung proudly next to a bronze plaque that read, "Founding Equity Partner, recognized in the ledger and in our memory." Cordelia attended quietly, sitting in the back row. Afterward, she handed Elowen a lacquered box containing Harrison's private letters. "I don't expect this to fix anything," the older woman said, her voice brittle. Elowen accepted the box. "It doesn't fix it, but it stops hiding it." Sloane did not attend, though she sent a legally mandated formal affidavit confirming the corporate gaslighting directives. Thatcher did not attend either. He had quietly liquidated his remaining minority shares at a steep discount to avoid a protracted civil suit, and relocated to a boutique firm in Chicago. The hospitality blogs called it a graceful, quiet exit. Elowen found the phrasing deeply fitting. Men who dedicate their lives to erasing women rarely require a spectacular scandal to fall. Sometimes, their greatest punishment is simply losing the power to narrate reality. During the ceremony, Elowen placed the original brown-bound ledger inside a custom, climate-controlled glass vitrine adjacent to the front desk. Not as a hollow trophy, but as a permanent warning. The scarred, decaying leather cover looked small compared to the towering crystal chandeliers, but every single person who walked past it instinctively slowed their pace. Numbers do not lie, as long as the hand holding the pen doesn't tremble, Elowen said into the microphone, echoing Calla's oldest lesson. Her voice caught only once, and no one in the room pretended not to notice. For decades, this hotel was hailed as the triumph of a single dynasty. Today, it will legally and historically be recognized as the fruit of the labor, the capital, and the unbreakable spine of a woman who didn't possess a famous surname, but possessed an ironclad word. Mr. Silas openly wept, wiping his face with a linen handkerchief. Mrs. Hattie started the applause before Elowen even finished the sentence. Beckett watched from the very back of the lobby. He wore no corporate lanyard, no suit jacket, just a crisp button-down shirt with his hands tucked into his pockets, looking exactly like a man keeping his promise to return through the front door. Elowen intentionally didn't look at him during the speech. She knew if she met his eyes, she might lose her composure. And in that exact moment, after a lifetime of being treated as a footnote, she needed to finish the sentence in her own name. Late that night, long after the jazz trio had packed up and the lobby had settled into a quiet, golden hush, Elowen walked alone up to the Azure Suite. There was no turn-down service prepared for Sloane. No suffocating floral arrangements. No PR binders. The antique oak mirror had been meticulously restored. The blue paint matched perfectly to hide the scar, and secured firmly to the wall. A small brass plaque now sat on the baseboard beneath it, quietly noting that the hotel's original master ledger had been preserved inside the stud cavity for 30 years. Elowen opened the balcony doors, letting the cold, salted wind off Monterey Bay flood the room. She thought of Calla signing over the deed to her house, meticulously tracking expenditures in the basement, bleaching sheets while the Sterlings clinked champagne glasses with politicians in the lobby above her head. She thought of herself, years later, standing in a hallway holding a severance agreement she had nearly signed just to avoid making a scene. Behind her, there was a soft knock on the open door. Beckett stood there, his hands in his pockets, intentionally not crossing the threshold. Silas told me I'd probably find you up here. Elowen smiled, keeping her eyes on the dark ocean. Silas talks entirely too much. He talks exactly the right amount. She turned and looked at the vintage brass key resting on the mahogany desk. Are you going to ask me if I'm okay? Beckett leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. No, but I am going to ask if you'd like some company. Elowen stood in the quiet room for a long moment. There was no manufactured urgency anymore. No crushing debts to hide. No corporate salvage operations. Just an open door, and a man patiently waiting for an honest answer. Today, she said softly, you can come in. He stepped inside slowly, moving with the quiet reverence of someone who respects a house that is still relearning how to trust its foundations. They stood shoulder to shoulder by the open balcony doors, not touching at first, just watching the moonlight fracture across the Pacific. Down below, the lobby safely guarded the leather ledger, the black and white photograph, and the soul of a hotel that finally knew exactly who it belonged to. What are you going to do with the Azure Suite? Beckett asked, his voice low over the sound of the crashing surf. Elowen watched their faint reflections in the antique mirror. I am definitely not turning it into an influencer lounge. He chuckled softly. Sound fiscal management. I'm renaming it the Calla Suite. Not to monetize a tragedy, but to remind everyone who sleeps here that luxury without memory is just an expensive movie set. Beckett nodded slowly. She would have loved that. Elowen felt the familiar sting of tears in her eyes, but this time, they didn't fall. She picked up the heavy brass key from the desk and closed her fingers tightly around it. For the longest time, that piece of metal had been a nostalgic memory, then a weapon, then a piece of criminal evidence. Now, it was just a profound responsibility. Thatcher handed this building to his mistress as if it was his birthright to give away, she said, speaking more to the room itself than to Beckett. But my mother kept the ledger open just long enough for me to find my way back. Outside, the dark waters of Monterey Bay reflected the warm, glowing lights of the hotel. Elowen took a deep breath, slipped the brass key into her pocket, and turned off the overhead lamp. For the first time, the hotel didn't feel like a stolen inheritance. It felt like home,